And after several hours during a chaotic gunfight where he was screaming at police that they were next and you're all gonna die and all this kind of stuff, he was eventually shot and killed. Rod Ansell's life started as an epic tale of survival.
Before Crocodile Dundee became a Hollywood sensation, there was Rod Ansell, a fearless bushman who survived 56 days alone in the wild, battling hunger, thirst, and predators. He never sought fame and fortune, but when Hollywood turned his story into legend, his real life took a darker turn. This is the untold, haunting truth behind the man who inspired Crocodile Dundee, the boy who could survive anything. Everyone is familiar with Crocodile Dundee, the charismatic bushman known for his ability to handle snakes, fight crocodiles, and maintain his composure in any situation with just a knife and a smile. But hardly any people know the real story behind the legend, the truth hidden under news stories, rumors, and campfire tales. Before the world met the movie hero, there was a real man who was tougher, wilder, and far more complex than any film could ever show. His name was Rodney William Ansell, and his story didn't start in Hollywood. It began in the harsh wilderness of northern Australia, a place so tough it could break even the strongest person. Rod was born on October 1st, 1954, in Murgon, Queensland. He was the third of 4 children born to Eva May and George William Ansell. His childhood wasn't about comfort or fancy things. It was about working hard and surviving. Life wasn't a bed of roses. It was rough, raw, and real, a constant test of strength and will. Every day taught him something new about strength and endurance, about earning what you needed with your hands. When Rod was 15, his family moved to the Northern Territory, where life was wild and challenging, and every day taught him how to be strong and independent. Yet Rod didn't see it as frightening. To him, it was pure freedom. In that wild, untamed land, he grew into the man people would one day remember as a legend. That freedom and toughness would serve him well as a young man when he took on one of the toughest jobs in the region, hunting massive water buffalo in the far north and selling the meat overseas. It was brutal, dangerous, and exhausting work, the kind that could cost you your life with just one wrong move. You had to be smart, strong, and a bit lucky to make it through. And Rod was all three. After months of hard work and life on the edge, he decided it was time for a break, a chance to step away from the danger and the endless grind. In May 1977, when Rod was just 22 years old, he planned a quiet fishing trip all by himself. He didn't take any maps or even his camera. This break wasn't about showing off. It was about escaping everything for a while. With only his small boat and his 2 little bull terrier pups, one with a hurt leg, Rod set off into the wild, trusting his skills and courage to carry him through. He told his girlfriend not to expect him back for a long time. He wanted peace and time alone. But nature had a different plan. While traveling deep in the Victoria River, Rod's boat suddenly hit something big. He said it might have been a whale, and before he knew it, the boat flipped over. Everything went flying. Rod, his things, and his dogs into the dark, moving water. It's one thing to be lost in the bush, but it's something much scarier to be stuck more than 100 miles from the nearest person, floating in a half-sunk boat with only one paddle. On the first night, while Rod wasn't watching, his small boat drifted out to sea. 2 days later, drained and weak from thirst, he paddled with all his strength until he reached a tiny island near the mouth of the Fitzmaurice River. There was no shelter, no one to help, and worst of all, no fresh water. With no clean water to drink, Rod was in serious danger. But he wasn't someone who gave up easily. He kept looking for water, following animal tracks and watching how the tides changed, until he finally discovered a small stream of fresh water above the salt line. That moment meant only one thing: he was going to survive. Rod built a camp and did what only a man born to the wild could do: adapt. He hunted wild cattle and buffalo, using every part of the animal, even finding ways to stay hydrated from them when water was scarce. He followed bees to their hives and feasted on wild honey. At night, he slept in trees to stay clear of crocodiles. Once, he shared a branch with a brown tree snake. Rod even killed a 16-foot crocodile, keeping its massive head as proof that man, not beast, had ruled that patch of wilderness. But survival wasn't just about danger from animals. For 56 long days, Rod fought hunger and thirst. But that wasn't all the wilderness threw at him. It also brought tiredness and a deep, painful loneliness. Still, he made it through. When help finally came, it wasn't from a big rescue team or an air search. It was just luck. He heard the gentle sound of horse bells far away and followed it until he found two Aboriginal stockmen and their boss, Luke McCall. By then, the sun had burned Rod's skin, leaving him thin and tired, but still alive. Despite all the challenges, he managed to survive. When they brought him back to civilization, the story exploded. Newspapers called him a modern-day Robinson Crusoe. Everyone wanted to hear about the brave man who had faced the wild and made it out alive. But if you had asked Rod about it, he would have just smiled and said it was no big deal. He once said, "All the blokes up in this country who work with cattle have narrow shaves all the time." But they never talk about it. You either got him or you didn't. So that's how I looked at it. That's what made Rod different. To him, the story wasn't extraordinary. It was just life. The land gave him everything he needed, and in return, he respected its danger. But the newspapers didn't want humility. They wanted a hero. And just like that, Rod Ansell, the quiet buffalo hunter from the Northern Territory, became a national sensation. Reporters followed him, television shows wanted interviews, and even the government took notice. He was named Territorian of the Year, a title that forever marked him as the man who put the top end on the world map. To the world, Rod was a hero. But to the people who actually met him, he was even more friendly, good-looking, and full of charm. His sun-lightened hair, bright blue eyes, and tanned skin gave him the rugged look of a movie star straight from the wilderness. He had an easy laugh, told great stories, and was always barefoot. Even in hotels or on airplanes, Rod never wore shoes. It wasn't to show off. It was just who he was. He wasn't pretending to be a man of the wild. He truly was one, and he never stopped living that way. It was this genuine spirit, this freedom and authenticity that drew people to him and made him unforgettable. And later that year, fate brought him love. He met Joanne Van Oos, a young radio operator from Melbourne working in a remote Aboriginal community at Wadai. She was 22, full of curiosity and compassion, and she saw beyond his fame. Together, they built a life that felt like a true bush story that was full of freedom, some adventure, and hope. They married and went on to have two sons, Callum in 1979 and Sean in 1981. For a moment, it seemed like Rod had everything: a family, a home, and a legacy larger than life. But legends can grow bigger than the people who create them. And as Rod would soon discover, when the spotlight fades and the excitement dies down, reality and civilization can be far harsher than the wilderness ever was. Caught between fame and the outback. Rod Ansell found himself caught between being a real-life wilderness hero and the Hollywood version of his story. As soon as people heard about what he had survived, Ansell got more attention than he wanted. He survived the harsh Australian wilderness for weeks, only to have strangers turn his life into a story for others to watch. Filmmaker Donald Oxenberg made a documentary about him in 1979 called To Fight the Wild, and the next year a book with the same title shared his adventure with readers all over the country. But not everyone believed him. Could someone really survive 56 days in the wild, drinking only cow blood and what they found in nature? Some locals thought it might have been a publicity stunt, or wondered why he didn't just follow the river to the nearest town. Could it have been that straightforward, or was there more to the experience, something only Ansell truly understood? The truth, as always, was more complicated. In interviews, Rod said he had just been on a fishing trip, but to his friends, he admitted the truth. He had been poaching crocodiles, breaking the law in a dangerous, remote world. The newspapers told a different story. They called him a modern-day Robinson Crusoe, a man who lived completely off the land, brave and clever. That idea, while impressive, only showed part of who he really was. Ansell spoke Urapunga fluently and was honored as a fully initiated white man by the local Aboriginal tribes, a connection few outsiders ever earned. Could anyone in Hollywood really capture a man so close to the land and its people? His life was full of contrasts, a blend of daring, hard-won respect, and abilities that most people could hardly imagine. And it was this very complexity that made him a figure the media couldn't ignore. In 1981, he appeared on Sydney's Parkinson TV show, telling his story in the same calm, simple way that helped him navigate through the wilderness. It was there that Paul Hogan first heard about him, and an idea began to form. Could this tough, clever, almost untouchable man become the model for a new kind of Australian hero in the movies? Suddenly, the line between real life and Hollywood fantasy started to blur. How much of the real man could survive in the film? Which parts of his personality would make it to the screen, and which would be changed or left out? By the time the documentary aired and the book was read by people all over, Rod was more than just a bushman. He had become a symbol, a link between the wild Australian outback and the imaginations of people far away. But even with all the cameras and stories, they couldn't show the tension, the quiet fear, or the careful thinking that had kept him alive. And the biggest question remains: when a legend takes on a life of its own, what happens to the real person behind it? When the cameras stopped and the applause faded, a quieter story waited, one no documentary or TV show could tell. Behind the legend and fame, struggles and secrets were about to catch up. What happened when the spotlight disappeared and only the harsh wilderness remained? The Crocodile Dundee connection. Rod Ansell was a man who lived on his terms. Shoes were almost never part of his life, worn only when circumstance absolutely demanded it. Even then, it was not out of habit or fashion, but out of necessity. When boarding a plane to Sydney, he slipped on a pair of flip-flops because the flight attendant insisted they were required for hygiene. He recalled the encounter with a mixture of humor and defiance. "I bet the bottom of my feet were a lot cleaner than the bottom of his shoes," he said, watching where he walked as if proving a point about the world and his place in it. For Ansell, this revolt wasn't rebellion for its own sake. It was a reflection of a life lived close to the earth, where practicality and instinct outweighed societal rules. Every step he took, barefoot or in flip-flops, carried the quiet confidence of a man who knew the land intimately, who had survived where others might have failed, and who refused to compromise his understanding of how to live, even in the face of polite authority. That simple defiance, that self-contained confidence, was the very essence of the Australian bushman. But who would have thought that such a man would inspire one of cinema's most beloved characters? And yet, in a twist as wild and untamed as the Australian wilderness itself, the man who shunned fame and fortune would soon see his rugged life transformed into a legend the whole world couldn't stop watching. Paul Hogan, the actor and writer, reportedly first heard of Ansell during an interview, captivated by stories of a man who had survived the wilderness for 56 days, surviving on the land in the most extreme conditions, even finding nourishment where few others could. This man, rugged and resourceful, appeared as if he had stepped out of a pulp adventure. Hogan's imagination was caught by reports of Ansell sleeping on the floor of a luxury hotel suite instead of the bed, marveling at the room's bidet, and navigating the absurdities of city life. Could the bushman, so at home among crocodiles and buffalo, survive in the world of taxis, skyscrapers, and cocktail parties? That question sparked the premise of Crocodile Dundee. When Hogan wrote his movie, it told the story of a man who was thrust into a world that was completely different from his own. It showed a tough, brave bushman going to New York City and winning people over with his humor, courage, and charm. The movie became a huge success, earning more than $328 million, even though it cost less than $10 million to make. It was not only a big hit in the United States, but also the most successful Australian movie ever made at the time. Yet, while Paul Hogan and the film became famous, few people outside Australia knew about the real man who inspired it, Rod Ansell. By the time Crocodile Dundee premiered in 1986, Ansell, his wife, and their 2 young sons were living in near isolation on a remote piece of land, 10 miles from the nearest phone. Attending a movie at a theater was not an option, but the world eventually reached him. Friends and family noticed how much the movie looked like his real-life adventures and called to tell him so. Did he feel proud, amused, or maybe something more complicated? Initially, Ansell didn't pay much attention, but a few years later, when he and a friend tried to start a tourism business on his property and thought to advertise it as the home of the real-life Crocodile Dundee, he ran into obstacles. Hogan's office sent a firm reply denying permission and even threatened legal action. Could he really claim the story as his own? Could he profit from the experiences that had defined him? The disappointment gnawed at him. Reportedly, he remained bitter about not receiving any money from the blockbuster until his dying day. But it wasn't just the legal issues that affected how he felt about fame. Some of the people who lived near him in the top end didn't like the media and didn't trust it. He once said, "It doesn't really matter whether the story is true or not, because the people who know me, the ones who live and work around here, already know who I am. And people up here don't like being in the media. They thought it was a terrible thing to do." In the end, his fame cost him something personal: the respect of some of the people around him. As time went on, the excitement that once surrounded his story began to fade, and the spotlight that had once found him slowly moved away. Robert Meluca, who met Ansell 2 years after the movie came out, noticed that the Crocodile Dundee story was already starting to fade away. By then, Ansell didn't really want to talk about it anymore. He was upset that he hadn't earned any money from it, and his family was living in tough conditions. The difference was significant compared to the happy, easygoing bushman depicted in the Hollywood movie. One can't help but wonder, did he feel robbed of recognition or simply misunderstood by the world he had so bravely navigated? As Hollywood continued to profit from his story, Bod's own life seemed to move in the opposite direction. He was more silent, more difficult, and far removed from the glitter and success his name had unknowingly helped build. While Paul Hogan earned millions, the man whose life served as inspiration for the character remained marginalized. The Bush hero was celebrated on screens worldwide, but the real-life hero, the survivor, and the family man remained largely unseen. Was it pride, circumstance, or simple bad luck that kept him from claiming his share? Perhaps it was all three. But beneath that quiet life, something was starting to fall apart. The bushman who had once been strong and calm on his own was now about to face new battles, ones that didn't come from the wild, but from inside himself. The place that built and broke a legend. The legend of Rod Ansell was built on survival, independence, and defying the modern world. But what happens when the world you've rejected starts closing in from every side? The wilderness may have made him a hero. However, it would also test every part of him that fame never touched. But to understand how it all began to unravel, we need to step back to the moment when Rod chose isolation over everything else. Rod and his wife, Joanne Van Oos, did something few people would dare. They turned their backs on the fame that had briefly made Rod a household name and moved deep into Arnhem Land, one of the most isolated regions in Australia's Northern Territory. There, at Meluca Station, with their 2 sons, they tried to live from the land, raising cattle and keeping as far away as possible. It was as far from Hollywood as one could get. But isolation has a way of changing people. What began as a dream of freedom slowly turned into a struggle for survival, not just against the wild, but against the pressures of money, family, and the creeping weight of reality. Rod didn't believe in banks, offices, or city conveniences. He refused electricity, rarely used vehicles, and preferred sleeping under the stars to sleeping under a roof. The land was his home, the animals his livelihood, and nature his teacher. To him, that was freedom. But out in the bush, freedom comes with a cost, and Rod was about to pay it in full. In 1985, Rod Ansell borrowed money to lease a piece of land in northern Arnhem Land, where he started Meluca Station, about 140 kilometers east of Darwin, near Kakadu National Park. The station was named after the Meluca trees that grew all around the area. Rod and his wife built their home near the Mary River, surrounded by wild bushland. He dreamed of turning the land into a working cattle farm that could provide a stable life for his family. But things didn't go as planned. Around the same time, the government launched the bovine brucellosis and tuberculosis eradication campaign, a disease control program that required farmers to shoot large numbers of wild buffalo. For Rod, it was devastating. He had hoped to catch and train those same buffalo to build a herd that would secure his family's future. Instead, he was forced to kill nearly 3,000 animals, destroying years of hard work and the dream that had brought him to Meluca in the first place. Losing the herd meant losing everything he had built. The land that once gave him purpose now felt empty, and every day became a reminder of what he'd lost. This wasn't just about losing money. It felt like a deep betrayal. He spoke out, saying the government should spend that money on AIDS research instead of killing healthy animals. He also saw other farmers getting big government loans, while he got nothing. Then weeds called Mimosa pigra began spreading across his land, destroying what was left of his pastures. No matter how hard he tried to fight back, everything seemed to turn against him. By 1991, Meluca Station couldn't survive anymore. Rod had no choice but to sell the land he had worked so hard to build. Rod must have felt crushed, watching everything he'd built with his hands disappear because of choices made far away by people who didn't understand his world. Maybe he felt angry, maybe betrayed. Perhaps he was just helpless, standing on the land he loved, knowing it was slipping away. In the end, how does a man like that keep believing in the system that broke him? The collapse of Meluca marked the beginning of Rod's troubles. Without money or land, he had to go back to living off the land, not for fun this time, but because he had no other choice. He was said to be surviving on unemployment payments and wild food he could find or hunt. In 1992, things got worse. He was charged with stealing cattle and fighting with another farm owner. The man, once celebrated as a hero, experienced a significant downfall. By the early 1990s, the legend of the fearless bushman was falling apart. The wild land he once ruled had become harsh and unforgiving, and the modern world, the one he had tried so hard to stay away from, had finally caught up with him. The wilderness hero was still alive, but everything around him had changed, and soon, not even the wilderness could protect him anymore. The descent into paranoia. Rod Ansell was once seen as the symbol of Australia's wild and fearless spirit, but his fall from grace turned into a sad story filled with pain and confusion. The same wilderness that had made him famous would eventually become the place where everything fell apart. How does a man tough enough to survive 56 days alone in the wild end up haunted by enemies that only exist in his mind? It didn't happen overnight. It began slowly, almost without notice. In 1992, his marriage ended, taking away the stability that had kept him balanced. By the mid-1990s, Rod had lost it all: his land, his livelihood, and with them, his sense of direction and purpose. When the wilderness seemed to turn against him, Rod turned to something that helped him forget for a while. Once known for his strength, he began using things that made him feel calm at first, but slowly changed the way he thought. Friends said the man who once laughed so easily now spoke in low, worried tones, believing that secret groups had taken his sons and that people were watching him from the dark. How does a man who once conquered the outback become so terrified of enemies that aren't even there? By 1999, Rod weighed barely 115 pounds. Paranoia and sleepless nights took the place of the muscles that once carried him through the wild. He lived on the outskirts of the Urapunga Aboriginal Reservation with Cherie Ann Hewson, inducted as a white member of the community, yet haunted by the feeling that someone was watching. The bushman, once a symbol of freedom, was now a prisoner of his mind. And somewhere in that descent, the line between survival and madness vanished forever. The final shootout. On the night of August 2nd, 1999, the real-life Crocodile Dundee, Rod, met a tragic and violent end. The man who once amazed Australia with his wilderness skills had changed. He was scared, confused, and no longer himself. That night, near a small caravan outside Livingstone, about 50 kilometers from Darwin, Ansell suddenly became very agitated and started causing chaos around the caravan. He damaged the window of a neighbor's car and frightened people nearby. As tension rose, the situation turned dangerous, leaving those who once saw him as a hero stunned and asking what had happened to him. By early morning, police blocked the roads nearby to stop him from escaping. But Ansell wasn't easy to catch. Years earlier, he had survived 56 days alone in the wild, living off the land. If anyone could hide or survive in the bush, it was him. But this time, he didn't run. He stayed. When the police arrived, Ansell reacted in a sudden and chaotic way. A tense and frightening struggle unfolded. Sergeant Glenn Hudson was fatally injured, and his partner, Senior Constable James O'Brien, tried to protect everyone. By the end, Ansell himself was also gone. The man who had once been admired for his courage and love of the outback had passed away at just 44 years old. It was a moment that left many asking questions and trying to understand what had happened. People all across Australia were heartbroken and confused. How could a man known for his kindness and love of nature turn into someone violent and afraid? Later, reports explained that Ansell had been using a strong substance, which made him paranoid, believing people were after him. He truly believed that secret groups were spying on him and had kidnapped his sons. His mind had lost touch with reality. A psychiatrist, Dr. Robert Parker, said that Ansell was suffering from substance-induced psychosis, which means his brain was deeply affected by the substances. He also said Ansell and his partner, Leslie Hewson, shared the same false beliefs, something doctors call a folie à deux, or madness shared by two. They both believed in the same fears that weren't real. The coroner's report revealed that Ansell had been hurt in many places during the final confrontation. The most serious injury affected a major blood vessel, and he passed away quickly after that. Ansell was buried in Arnhem Land in a traditional Aboriginal ceremony. His family, including his two sons and parents, came to say goodbye. Many who knew him said the same thing. He wasn't evil, just lost and broken by fear. One man who had helped Rod years earlier said, "He was very skilled with his rifle. He could have caused serious harm, but thankfully, it didn't come to that." Even with all his skills and knowledge of the bush, something stopped him that day. Why didn't he run? Why didn't he hide in the bush he knew so well? Maybe he was worn out. Maybe he didn't want to live in a world that had changed too much for him. So, what do you think shaped the real-life Crocodile Dundee? Was it the harsh outback, the experience of fame and disappointment, or a mind pushed to its limits by fear and isolation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.